Across the United States, stories are told of a woman dressed in white who appears often late at night, usually near a road, bridge, cemetery, or water. She might interact briefly, ask for help, or she may just stand there, sometimes close, sometimes off in the distance. Then she vanishes, oftentimes without even saying a word. The details may change depending on where you are, but the image does not, and she's often referred to just as the woman in white. The name is deceptive, sounding as if to reference one singular woman, but the woman in white isn't one ghost. She isn't tied to any singular tragedy, and she doesn't belong only to a single region, state, or town. She is what we call a reoccurring apparition motif, meaning the character shows up again and again across regions, with local variations layered on top. And she didn't start in America, obviously. Versions of the Lady in White appear throughout European folklore centuries before the US was even formed. In places like Germany, Austria, and parts of the Czech Republic, Lady in White legends were often tied to castles and noble families. In some traditions, she was seen as an omen of death. In others, she was believed to be the spirit of a woman betrayed, imprisoned, or murdered. If we examine even deeper, we learn that the white isn't random. In older stories, white clothing was associated with burial clothing, mourning attire, and liminality, the space between states, between life and death, between here and somewhere else. Then as European settlers made their way to North America, they brought those stories along with them. But something interesting happened in the transition. We started to see the settings change. Instead of Europe's castles and estates, the American Lady in White began appearing along rural roads, at the edges of forests, near bridges, lakes, or bodies of water, and of course cemeteries. Her existence and the sightings adapted to the landscape. In early American accounts of her, especially in the 1800s, she's often described to be seen near burial grounds or crossroads. Then, as automobile culture exploded, the location shifted again. Highways became the new liminal space, the place between destinations, a place you can find yourself passing at night, oftentimes alone, where the atmosphere and setting are ripe for a ghostly encounter. And that's when the roadside versions of her began to multiply. After the rise of car travel, the roadside Lady in White became one of the most reported ghost encounter types in the country. Drivers in completely different states describe almost identical encounters without necessarily knowing about each other's versions. Most ghost stories are hyperlocal, hyperspecific, tied to a specific building or event, but the Lady in White trope seems to show up in liminal spaces, wherever there's a boundary: water and land, road and forest, cemetery and open field, one town and the next. And that adaptability is why she keeps resurfacing. The thing that stands out about this ghostly archetype is also restraint. You generally will not be attacked by her. She won't chase you, and she rarely speaks, nonetheless screams or screeches. She usually simply just appears. She'll react or engage calmly sometimes, and then she'll disappear. There is no dramatic confrontation in most versions. Her haunting impact is rarely correlated to the things that go bump in the night, but the fear she induces stems from recognition. There's a moment where you realize you're looking at something that feels strangely familiar but often misplaced. And that familiarity might be the most important part, because over time, the woman in white became one of the most adaptable ghost figures in American folklore. Stories have spread of a woman in white appearing as a hitchhiker, a mourning widow. She's been tied to water. She can be connected to a cemetery. She can speak. She can remain silent. But she is almost always described in the same way visually. White dress, pale appearance, usually late at night and appearing in transitional spaces. When an image repeats across regions that never directly shared the same story, it usually means one of two things. Either the story traveled and evolved, or the environment itself encourages similar narratives to form independently. With the Lady in White, it appears to be a bit of both. What we're going to do in this video is look at how this single archetype manifests differently depending on geography, culture, and time period, and why certain elements remain consistent no matter where you go. We're going to step back and examine what connects them. Those of you who are here from my TikTok are probably expecting specific regional stories across the states, and don't worry, I have some of those too. But before we do that, there is one more piece of the origin story that matters. In many early European Lady in White legends, the figure wasn't just tragic. She was unfinished. She was tied to something unresolved: betrayal, loss, a missing child, an unmarked grave, and injustice. When that concept carried into American folklore, it merged with local tragedies: drownings, accidents, disappearances, epidemics. And over time, people began retrofitting backstories to the sightings, not because there was confirmed evidence, but because humans want, cause. When someone sees a woman in white at the edge of a lake, the instinct is to search records for a drowning. When someone sees her near a cemetery, the instinct is to tie her to a grave. The story grows around the sighting. And that's important because in many documented lady in white cases, there is no confirmed historical record that clearly explains the apparition. The identity shifts, the behavior shifts, the environment shifts, but the image remains. And that's where the archetype becomes bigger than any one town. By the time people hear about a lady in white story, they already feel like they've seen her somewhere before. And that's not accidental or coincidence. Long before social media, long before TikTok or YouTube retellings like this one, the image of the woman in white had already made its way into film, television, novels, and urban legend collections. Constantly bombarded by this media, you would think pop culture invented her, but it didn't. It simply amplified her. So let's talk about the image in media and how that impacted sightings and the reach of her lore. Early cinema leaned heavily into the existing folklore. Silent films and early horror films borrowed from European ghost traditions. Pale women drifting through corridors, standing by windows, appearing at the edge of forests. The visual was simple, high contrast, memorable, instantly readable on screen. The key was the white fabric. It catches light, it moves unnaturally in darkness, and it can create the silhouette of something that feels human, but slightly off. And because the lady in white was already a part of oral traditions across the globe, audiences didn't question it. They recognized it. Now shift to the mid-20th century, especially as American horror films became more psychological. The woman in white moved away from castle corridors and towards roadside and domestic spaces that are familiar to all. She appeared near highways, in mirrors, in hallways, and at the foot of a scared little kid's bed. The setting modernized and expanded to make it feasible that you, as an average person, could encounter her too. Adding to the drama in many documented roadside lady in white encounters from the 1950s and 60s, witnesses described the event in cinematic terms. They would say things like, "It felt like I was in a movie. It didn't seem real. It was like something I had seen before." But in some of those cases, there was not a widely known film version yet, which raises a fascinating question. Did movies shape the sightings, or did the sightings shape the movies? Aside from the eerie and unsettling feeling when encountering the lady in white, there's the reoccurring image. A woman in white, standing at the edge of something, head slightly lowered. She's still, she's silent. That image shows up in American horror repeatedly. This standard repetition triggers recognition. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as archetypal imprinting, when an image becomes so culturally embedded that it feels older than the story attached to it. The lady in white functions almost like a visual shortcut to unease. You don't need backstory, you don't need exposition. The image alone carries weight. Even modern horror films still lean on the same visual language. Pale dress, night setting, liminal space, ambiguous expression. The character may get a different name, a different origin, a different ending, but the core image rarely changes. And then there's television. Urban legend episodes from the 1980s and 90s frequently featured variations of the vanishing hitchhiker or the silent woman by the road. These shows didn't invent the stories, they dramatized them. One of the clearest modern examples is the pilot episode of Supernatural. If you're new here, there's one thing you need to know for sure. I will always find a way to talk about Supernatural. The very first case Sam and Dean investigate is titled Woman in White. It takes place on a bridge at night. A woman in a white dress stops drivers. She gets into their car. She speaks. She asks a question. And depending on the answer, the interaction may become deadly. What's important isn't that the show invented her. Obviously it didn't. The episode was inspired by American vanishing hitchhiker lore and older lady in white traditions that predate the series by decades. But for a generation of viewers, that may have been their first introduction to the archetype. A woman in white, near a road, appearing suddenly, interacting briefly, then disappearing. And once that image is broadcast nationally, it reinforces the visual language. Then there's stories like the Curse of La Llorona. La Llorona originates from Mexican and Latin American folklore centuries older than most American roadside versions. She is traditionally described as a weeping woman near rivers or bodies of water, mourning children that she allegedly drowned. Different culture, different origin story, but visually, she is almost always portrayed in white, near water, at night, appearing suddenly, vanishing just as quickly. The 2019 film didn't create the image, it formalized it for a modern audience. It gave the archetype a cinematic template. And once something becomes cinematic, it becomes unforgettable. Even outside explicitly Latin American lore, we see similar visual continuity in films like The Woman in Black. In that story, the female apparition appears in pale clothing, often near marshland and water, connected to tragedy but visually echoing the same silhouette we've seen repeated again and again. Even when the origin changes, the aesthetic remains. And that's what makes the Lady in White such a durable figure in horror media. She doesn't require exposition. If a character sees a woman in white standing alone at night, the audience doesn't need to be told she's a ghost. They already understand. The image carries cultural weight. Television amplified this even further in the late 20th century. Urban legend documentaries and paranormal shows dramatized roadside sightings and cemetery encounters, often using nearly identical costuming and staging. See my childhood trauma from the Lady in White story in an Unsolved Mysteries episode that still makes me uneasy to this day. What started as oral folklore became televised reenactment. And once it's reenacted, it spreads faster. Now, imagine someone growing up watching these portrayals. Years later, they drive down a dark road and see something pale near the shoulder. Even if the sighting is unexplained, their brain does not categorize it as random. It categorizes it as familiar. That doesn't mean media created the experience. It means media gave the archetype sharper edges. Once broadcast, those stories spread faster. And this is where we begin to see a loop. A local legend becomes a broadcasted story. The broadcasted story reaches new towns. Those towns adapt it to their geography. New sightings are reported, media borrows from the updated version, and around it goes. The Lady in White becomes self-sustaining. That reach simply means that she fits. She fits near water. She fits near cemeteries. She fits on highways. She fits in dream sequences. She fits in horror marketing posters. Very few ghost archetypes are that flexible. The Headless Horseman requires a specific look. The Haunted Doll requires an object. The Shadow Man relies on darkness. But a woman in white, she can appear anywhere there's contrast, and contrast is everywhere at night. There's also something visually practical about the Lady in White in film. As I mentioned before, white fabric catches low light. It moves unnaturally in wind. It creates contrast against darkness. Cinematically, it's efficient. Folklorically, it is symbolic. White can represent mourning. It can represent burial garments. It can represent purity or unfinished rites. In some cultures, white is the color of death. So when film and television use a woman in white as shorthand for a haunting, they are not inventing symbolism. They're tapping into something older. And here's where the loop becomes even more clear. Folklore supplies the image. Film sharpens it. Television repeats it. Audiences internalize it. New sightings are described using the reinforced image. Those sightings are retold, sometimes adapted back into fiction, and the archetype grows stronger. By the time someone encounters a regional Lady in White story, whether it's in Texas, Georgia, Connecticut, California, Indiana, or Maryland, the image already feels lived in. It feels inherited. Not because every sighting comes from a movie, but because the image has been circulating for so long, it feels embedded in cultural memory. And that's what makes this archetype different from many other ghost stories. It does not stay local, it scales. From folklore to film to television to real-world retellings and back again. There's another layer here that's worth mentioning. In media, the Lady in White is often framed as tragic, wronged, abandoned, searching. But in real folkloric accounts, she's frequently neutral. She doesn't always demand justice. She doesn't always seek revenge. She doesn't always complete a task. Sometimes she just appears. That neutrality is what keeps the archetype adaptable. When filmmakers want to turn her violent, they can. When writers want to make her sorrowful, they can. When storytellers want her to be a warning, she will be. The core image survives every reinterpretation, and that might explain why people across different states describe their encounters in nearly identical terms. Because when something looks like it belongs in the movie, it's easier to remember. It's easier to retell. And over time, the retelling reinforces the image. So by the time someone sees a pale figure standing near a lake or cemetery at night, their brain already has a category for it. And that categorization may happen before the conscious mind catches up. Which brings us back to the question that always lingers with this archetype. Is the reoccurring because she's real? Or because the image is so deeply embedded in cultural memory that it reappears wherever there's darkness, water, or a lonely road? The answer might not be either or. It might be that folklore and media are feeding each other, and somewhere in that loop, the Lady in White stopped belonging to one town and started belonging to all of them. Now here are a few cases of the Lady in White from various states across the US. In Texas, one of the most well-known versions of the Lady in White is tied to White Rock Lake in Dallas. People driving near the lake late at night have reported seeing a woman dressed completely in white standing near the shoulder of the road. In a lot of the stories, she's barefoot and she's soaking wet like she just came out of the water. Sometimes she's crying, sometimes she doesn't say anything at all. In many versions, a driver pulls over and asks if she needs help. She gets into the car quietly and gives an address somewhere nearby in Dallas. She doesn't make conversation, she just sits there. But before they ever reach the address, the back seat is suddenly empty. No door opening, no sound, she's just gone. Some drivers say they still go to the address she gave them, and when they do, they're told the same thing every single time. A young woman drowned in White Rock Lake years ago, and people have been showing up asking about her ever since. Dallas locals don't really tell this like a ghost story. It's more like a warning you grow up hearing. Don't stop near the lake late at night. You never know what those dark waters are holding on to. In Connecticut, there's a lady in white story tied to Union Cemetery, and locals have been talking about her for decades. Union Cemetery isn't hidden, it's not dramatic. During the day, it looks like any other old New England cemetery. Modest headstones, quiet road nearby, trees that feel older than the town itself. But at night, people say something shifts. Visitors who go there after dark report seeing a woman dressed entirely in white moving between the headstones. Sometimes she's standing completely still, like she's waiting. Other times she's walking slowly, almost pacing, but never in a straight line. More like she's tracing something only she can see. What's even more strange than what she does is what she doesn't do. She doesn't ask for help. She doesn't wave anyone over. She doesn't step into anyone's path. She doesn't even seem surprised to be seen. In a lot of the stories, people describe the same sequence. They notice her at a distance. They watch her for a few seconds, trying to convince themselves it's a trick of the light. And then, right as they're sure they're looking at a person, she fades. She doesn't run. She doesn't turn. She doesn't slip behind a tree. She simply isn't there anymore. No footsteps in the gravel, no sounds in the leaves, no physical exit, just absence. Some visitors say she appears near the same sections of the cemetery repeatedly, but no one can agree on who she's supposed to be. There isn't one grave everyone points to. There isn't a confirmed name that anchors the legend. No tragic newspaper clippings everyone references. There's just her. Connecticut doesn't argue about whether she exists. They talk about her like the weather, like something that's always been a part of Union Cemetery. In the Texas Lady in White story, she gets into the car. She engages. She finishes the interaction. Here, she refuses it. Same figure, different boundary. She never leaves the cemetery. She never tries to complete a story. She never gives away why she's even there. She appears. She allows herself to be noticed. And then she decides when it's over. Why does she show up only there? Why disappear the moment someone is certain? Why refuse interaction altogether? If she wanted help, she would ask. If she wanted revenge, she would act, but this version does neither. In Indiana, there's a lady in white tied to Step Cemetery, and this one carries a very different energy than the roadside versions. It's quieter, heavier, and somehow more personal. Step Cemetery sits back in the woods. You don't just pass it accidentally, you have to go looking for it. And people who go there at night say they see a woman dressed in white standing between the headstones or just along the tree line where the forest begins. She's not wet or crying. She's not asking for help or a ride. She's just there. What makes this version unsettling isn't the disappearance, it's the distance. Visitors say she starts out far enough away that you can almost convince yourself it's a trick of the light between the stones, a pale shape, a reflection. But if you keep watching, she gets closer. You don't see her run, glide, or lunge. You just see that she's closer. Close enough that you're suddenly aware she wasn't standing there a moment ago. Some people report seeing her kneeling near certain graves. Though no one agrees on which ones. Others say she stands facing the woods instead of the cemetery, like her attention is fixed on something beyond the headstones. And that detail matters because if she's facing the woods, she's not mourning, she's watching. Visitors who stay longer say the air feels different once she's near. Not colder in a dramatic way, just charged, like you've stepped into something that's been aware of you since you arrived. And then eventually she's gone. No footsteps on gravel, no leaves crunching, no clear exit. You don't see her leave, you just realize she isn't there anymore. Nobody agrees on who this one is either. Some tie her to a burial in the cemetery. Others insist she's older than the marked graves, older than the road that leads there. There's no confirmed name, no single grave everyone points to, no clean explanation. Again, same figure, different behavior. In Connecticut, she refuses interaction. She fades when acknowledged. Here, she approaches, slowly, intentionally, and she never seems surprised to be seen. So what do you think she wants? If she's not asking for help and she's not finishing a story, why draw nearer at all? And if she's watching the woods instead of the people, what do you think she's actually paying attention to? In California, there's a lady in white story tied to the stretch of road near Santa Paula, and what makes this version unsettling isn't what she does, it's how often she's seen. Drivers heading through the area late at night describe seeing a woman dressed in white standing near the roadside, usually close to the edge where the road drops off into darker terrain. There aren't streetlights everywhere. There are long stretches where your headlights are the only light source. And then she's there. She's not trying to flag anyone down. She's not walking into traffic. She's not pacing or drifting. She's just standing there, completely still. What makes this different from the others is that the sightings don't come in isolated bursts. It's not one dramatic story passed down through generations. It is repetition. Multiple drivers, different years, different weather, same exact location. People describe her in almost the same way. White dress, same section of the road, same posture, same stillness. Some drivers say they slow down because they're waiting for her to move, waiting for her to step into the road, waiting for the moment where it becomes an emergency instead of just a sighting, but nothing happens. She doesn't move towards the cars. She doesn't react to the headlights. She doesn't flinch. And when the car passes, she doesn't vanish in some dramatic way. In a lot of the stories, she's still standing there in the rear view mirror for a few seconds longer than feels normal. Long enough that drivers say they keep checking the mirror to make sure she's finally gone. Locals don't have a single explanation for her. Some tie her loosely to accidents along the road. Others say she's been reported since before the modern highway expanded, when the stretch was darker and quieter. There's no agreed upon name, no confirmed incident that anchors her there, no one story everyone tells the same way. And that's what makes this one feel different. In Texas, she gets into the car. In Connecticut, she fades when noticed. In Indiana, she draws closer. Here, she doesn't approach. She doesn't retreat. She repeats. California locals talk about her casually, almost like she's part of the road now. Like if you drive through late enough at night, you might just see her. Not guaranteed, not dramatic, just possible. Same figure, different pattern. This version isn't about interaction or proximity, it's about endurance. Seeing the same woman in the same place night after night and realizing it's not just you. If multiple people across years are describing her exactly the same way, standing exactly where the headlights hit, what do you think she's waiting for? In Maryland, there's a lady in white story tied to Crybaby Bridge, and this version is known specifically for one thing. She actually interacts. Crybaby Bridge is small, unmarked. During the day, it looks completely normal. You could drive over it and never think twice, but at night, people report seeing a woman dressed in white, standing near the railing or just before the bridge itself. Unlike the other versions, she doesn't stay silent. In a lot of the stories, if you slow down or roll your window down, she speaks. Sometimes she asks for help. Sometimes she asks if you've seen her baby. Sometimes she just cries, not loudly or dramatically, just enough that you know the sound was meant for you. And that's where this one becomes uncomfortable. People say the interaction feels normal at first, like you've stopped to help someone who's upset. Her voice sounds human. Her posture isn't exaggerated. For a few seconds, it feels completely ordinary. But the longer it goes on, the more something feels off. Her answers don't quite line up with the questions being asked. Her tone doesn't shift the way it should. Her expression doesn't match what she's actually saying. Some people say if they glance away for even a second, to check mirrors, to look at the bridge, to think about what she just said, she's suddenly closer to the car than she was before. She doesn't rush or anything, she just is closer. Others say she disappears mid-sentence. No fading, no running, just a break in the conversation, and then the space in front of the car is empty. There are different stories about who she's supposed to be. Some say she lost a child near the bridge. Others say she jumped from it herself. There's no single version everyone agrees on, no confirmed record that clearly explains why she would appear there at all. Maryland locals don't recommend stopping on the bridge at night, not because she's going to chase you, not because she's going to harm you, but because once you engage with her, you don't know how the interaction is supposed to end. The other ladies in white appear. This one waits for you to respond. Same figure, but this version doesn't exist in the background. She reacts. And that's what makes people uneasy, because if she's responding to you, what do you think she's trying to figure out? And if the conversation doesn't end on your terms, whose does it end on? In Georgia, there's a lady in white story tied to Lake Lanier, and this one carries a weight that goes beyond a single ghost story. Lake Lanier is already known for its reputation. The lake was created in the 1950s when entire communities were flooded to build the reservoir. Some of that history includes the displacement of black families and the destruction of a once thriving town. Over the decades, the lake has also become known for its high number of drownings and boating accidents. So even before anyone mentions a ghost, there's an uneasiness there. But layered into all of that history is another reoccurring image. People who spend time on the lake, especially at night or early in the morning, report seeing a woman dressed in a pale blue or white dress standing near the shoreline or waist deep in the water. She's not walking along the road like in other stories. She's not asking for help. She's already in the lake. Some witnesses say she's facing the water, not them. Others say she looks like she's trying to climb out, one hand braced against the shore, but never quite succeeds. And one detail shows up again and again: the stillness. Even when the water around her is moving, even when there's wind, even when boat waves ripple towards her, she remains still. In some stories, boaters say they don't even notice her at first. They become aware of her only after something mechanical shifts. Their engines stall, their lights flicker, the boat drifts strangely. And when they look towards the shoreline, she's there. When they look again, she's either gone or closer to the bank than she was before. There is no single version of who she's supposed to be. Some locals connect her to drownings. Others say she predates the lake entirely, that she's tied to what was submerged beneath it. No one agrees on a name. No one agrees on a timeline. No one can point to one grave or one record and say, that's her. What makes this version especially strange is how familiar witnesses describe the moment. More than one person has said it felt like something they'd already seen before, maybe in a movie. A woman in white, water, silence, that slow tightening realization that you're looking at something you recognized, but you can't remember where from. Not because it's fictional, but because the image has been repeated so many times in folklore and media that it feels like memory instead of imagination. Georgians don't recommend being on Lake Lanier at night at all, actually, and not just because of the statistics. They say if you see a woman standing where she shouldn't be in the water, the worst thing you can do is stare long enough to convince yourself she isn't real. Because if she's already in the lake, she may not be trying to leave it. Now, when you step back and look at everything together, the European origins, the American roadside versions, the cemetery sightings, lake encounters, the television episodes, the horror films, what stands out isn't just repetition, it's consistency. Different states, different decades, different witnesses, same silhouette. A woman in white, at night, in a transitional space. She doesn't usually chase or scream, she doesn't need to. The image does the work. And that's what makes the lady in white different from most ghost stories. She doesn't stay tied to one building. She doesn't belong to one tragedy. She isn't confined to one culture. She adapts. Castles became crossroads. Crossroads became highways. Highways became bridges. Bridges became scenes in television shows. But the figure stayed intact. In so many regional versions, there isn't a confirmed death record. There isn't a single grave everyone agrees on. Based on the state stories, there isn't one name that closes the story. Instead, the story grows around the sighting. Someone sees her by a body of water. The town searches for a drowning. Someone hears about a tragedy. The legend absorbs it. The image comes first, the explanation comes later. Which raises a strange possibility. What if the lady in white isn't a ghost tied to one unfinished story? What if she's an archetype that attaches itself to whatever liminal space is available? Roads, water, cemeteries, bridges, places where people are already between things. Between destinations, between life and death, between memory and imagination. And if that's the case, then maybe the reason she feels so familiar isn't just because of the movie. Maybe it's because transitional spaces feel familiar to all of us. For the most part, we've all driven alone at night, stood near bodies of water and felt the quiet. Everyone has on some level walked past a cemetery and looked just a little too long. The lady in white fits those spaces so perfectly that she almost feels inevitable. And that's what makes her endure, not because she's proven and not because she's disproven, but like we said, it's because she fits. She fits in folklore, she fits in film, she fits in memory. And once an image fits that well, it does not disappear. It resurfaces in another town, on another road, in another story. So the next time you hear about a woman in white standing somewhere she shouldn't be, you have one of two options. You can dismiss it as recycled folklore, or you can ask yourself why the same figure keeps reappearing across geography, across generations, across media. Because if an image survives that long, it's either deeply embedded in the culture or it's deeply embedded somewhere else. And that's where I think I'm going to leave it. We do have a TikTok page at Witchgarbage, so please follow and support there. Hit all the buttons here and of course subscribe here. This is only episode 1 of hopefully many. Each week, we're going to bring new horror archetypes or concepts and stories of the regions that they linger in, added with pop culture and media embedded. Other weeks, I think I'm just going to retell all your stories. If there is anything that you're dying to hear about, let me know in the comments and I'll see what I can do. If you have stories of your own, email them, witchgarbage11@gmail.com. Stay eerie and curious, and I'll see you in your next encounter.